All right, so we're gonna activate this tiredness now that happens, or this passing out feeling that happens when people work with the tongue. And I found this by coincidence in a way, because with me it doesn't really happen so much, because I think my brain cells are already breathing quite well. It happens a bit, but not so much. But in the last webinars on the tongue, which are now posted on that page, the central core of holographic breathing, we ran two, and in the first one everybody stayed awake. It was fine, which was what I wanted. In the second one I went about it a bit differently, and in the first one we ran the visualization back through the central line, down the spine, and then up the front of the body, and we connected it all that way. In the second one I very much connected the trachea, the lungs, the diaphragm and the abdomen at the same time. And it was that one that everybody was, or most people were finding it hard to stay awake. Most people were passing out. So I investigated it, and that's where the veil was. If we connect to the tongue through the bone structure and then to the brain, you feel very much this breathing motion of the brain cells. So working with the jaw and the tongue together, the jaw, there's a big movement of the breath with the jaw. Then you move to the tongue, there's still a motion of the breath with the tongue, but it's got less, and it's much more to do with the viscera. We start moving up to the nasal passageways and the sinuses, and it gets smaller. We move up to the eyes and the ethmoid, and it becomes a higher energy, but the actual physical motion of the breath becomes less. And when we connect through the jaw, there isn't this sleepiness, but as soon as people connect to the tongue through their diaphragm and through their abdomen and then to the brain, that's where the veil is. That's where the unconsciousness is. That's where the change of state is. That's where this sleepy, I can't stay awake, I'm going to pass out, happens. It's in that energy connection from the organs, from the lungs, from the heart, through the trachea, through the tongue, and directly into the brain. And the way to get around it, the way to not fall asleep, the way to not pass out, the way not to feel at effect of this sleepiness or unconsciousness, is that feeling of a yawn, or that feeling of an unconsciousness coming. Allow that feeling to be an energy and to travel through the brain, and you'll feel that what is actually happening there is that the brain is coming to life, and instead of it coming to life, we're passing out, or people are passing out. But if you allow that yawn or that I'm going to go to sleep to travel through the brain, you'll find that you'll feel this energy moving from cell to cell. It's like you can feel all the individual cells, and you feel it through different, just moving through the cells of the brain. And it is waking the brain up. It is a breath, but we're now, in the first one with the jaw, it's very much a movement of the breath. With this, it's more, it is the breath, it is the movement of the breath, but it's also an energy of the breath through the tongue. And for me, it is activating all of the brain cells, but for me a lot of it is going through the astrocyte cells, because the tongue is within the lower regions for the face, so it's the lower energies, and the astrocyte cells are the connective tissue. They are the viscera for the brain, so it's connecting to those, and they don't hold the intellect in the same way as the neurons do. So you're accessing an intelligence of the brain that isn't per se the intellect. And because we're so used to working with the intellect, when we come into this other manifestation or intelligence of the brain, we just pass out, or people just pass out. But if you allow that tiredness and you allow that passing out just to be an energy, you'll feel it moving as an energy through the brain. And then once you get an access to that, of what is actually happening, then the unconsciousness goes, and each time those waves of energy goes through the cells of the brain, it brings it more to life. And there are some interesting things with this, because for me the movement of the brain with the breath is a lot to do with these little sea anemones, and they're just moving with the breath, and it's the whole cranium, the whole brain is moving with them. It is also happening through the neurons and the myelinating glial cells as well, but it seems majorly through the astrocyte cells. Now, for things like Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, all of these aging diseases where people can't remember anything and lose their different brain function, the neurons stay intact. They're still working fine. The synapses are working fine. What dies off in these diseases is the astrocyte cells. And then people lose all of their functions because of that, because of the communication through the astrocyte cells. And that for me is the physical body of the brain. So if we can learn to breathe with these astrocyte cells, so in a way they're exercising, they're breathing, and to allow the energies to travel through. I'm hoping that this is going to produce a lot of health and longevity for us. Because I think a lot of aging is that the brain is aging, that the cells are not breathing as they were. And then and the brain is the physical top of the pyramid for the body. You know, it does energetically go higher, but it doesn't physically really go any higher. So as that degenerates, then the whole body just follows along with it. And I know this very well because I had Lyme's disease. It's been really a terrible disease for me. And that attacks the brain and everything else follows. You can't stop it. It all just goes down with it. So, and the holographic breathing came through was one of the things that really saved me from Lyme's disease, because it was addressing the brain. It was bringing life back to the brain. So we're now going to address this area from the trachea, from the lungs and heart, from the diaphragm, and from the organs. And now, not everybody has done that first webinar. So for all the people who haven't, the very first webinar on the page, the central core of holographic breathing, I really advise that you go to that and buy that webinar. I've just put it up so it's at a third of the price at the minute. It's only £2. There's no excuse. And for 2 hours we go into that dynamic of how that also moves the jaw. What is happening is, as the diaphragm drops, that brings down the lungs, that brings down the trachea, which is part of the lungs. The trachea joins to the hyoid bone here. As the hyoid bone drops, the jaw opens. As the hyoid bone rises, the jaw closes. So the movement of the jaw, if the jaw is just left relaxed, as the diaphragm drops, the jaw drops. And also, as the hyoid bone drops, the tongue is connected to the roof of the mouth. So that movement I said of the tongue expanding and feeling as if it's moving it back, it is, because the hyoid bone is dropping. So it is pulling back and widening. And the tongue is connecting to the roof of the mouth. And if we let the roof of the mouth just be solid, then it's just the tongue moving. But if we allow the roof of the mouth to be malleable, on the in-breath, the roof of the mouth drops. On the out-breath, the roof of the mouth rises with the diaphragm. The roof of the mouth is the diaphragm for the face. As the diaphragm drops, the roof of the mouth drops and opens. As the diaphragm rises and domes, the roof of the mouth rises and domes. They move together. These two different diaphragms working together. Just got to find a picture. Most people have seen this, but so if we look at the picture of the face as a holographic representation of the torso, the jaw, it's like the pelvis, the tongue is the abdomen and organs of the abdomen. The roof of the mouth is the diaphragm. See the heart there? The 4 ventricles of the heart is the nasal passageways. The lungs here and here, the lungs for the face. These sinuses are the lungs. Then we move up into the higher energies. You have the ethmoid. This is to do with the brain and cranial fluid. The eyes to do with the brain, the intellect. So you've got below the diaphragm, you've got the abdomen and lower energies. You've got the heart and the lungs, more to do with feeling, emotions. And you come up, you've got the brain, the intellect, and the higher energies. The diaphragm is the roof of the mouth. When the diaphragm drops, underneath the diaphragm is the stomach. Stomach drops down. There's a tube, the esophagus, going from the stomach to the hyoid bone. Pulls down the hyoid bone, the tongue's pulled down, the roof of the mouth drops. The diaphragm, roof of the mouth, dropping and opening on the in-breath, rising and doming on the out-breath. And as the roof of the mouth starts to breathe in that way, all of the organs of the face, the eyes, the sinus, it all starts to breathe, all starts to work. So we're going to work that relationship with the brain rather than through the bones and the jaw. We're going to relate how the diaphragm works with the tongue and the organs work with the tongue. And again, as the diaphragm drops here, it's pulling down, and it's pulling down towards the pelvic diaphragm. Breathing in, everything expands. Breathing out, everything narrows. Breathing in, breathing out. So you have that movement in the abdomen, you have that movement in the brain. So we're probably going to go over by a little bit, so I just want to check, is everybody okay that we might go a little bit longer, maybe 5 minutes or so longer? Everyone's okay? All right, good. I just don't, just wanted to check if I needed to go a bit faster, but luckily I can just go at my own pace. I know it's a lot of information, but I would just like to show the rest of these pictures so you can get a good images of the brain. So there's the cells again. I'm not going to go through them, but you can see the cranial fluid, you can see the astrocyte cells, you can see the neurons, but you can just see how much cranial fluid there, how aqueous it all is. There is the ventricles in the brain that drops down into the spine. These are full of cranial fluid. That's the, whoops, that's upside down. That you've got the brain stem here, thalamus, the cerebellum, and then you've got, see how the ventricles wrap around it and are inside it, makes a little face, makes a little bird, the face is here. This is the ventricles and the brain stem from the front. You've got the ventricles here, here. You've got the brain stem. You've got the cerebellum either side. You don't have to remember any of this. This gives you images of what it looks like. Often people see this as a very female image, or see the female genitalia here. It has quite a female image to a lot of people. It's the center of the brain. There we have that with the cerebrum on top. I've done these in watercolor so it gives that quality of fluidity and cranial fluid. You've got the cerebrum around it, the brain stem, the ventricles, the thalamus, the cerebellum. Again, the face is here. This is as it drops off down the spine. People quite often separate it where it comes through the cranium, but if you allow this all to join up, so the spinal cord naturally forms into the brain stem and cerebellum, and then that naturally forms into the cerebrum on top. This is from the side, this is from the front. So the kundalini can come through if you hold it as one image rather than separating it. Quite often people think of the myelin sheath as a sheath. There is a picture of it from the side. It's full of cranial fluid, and for me these transport the cranial fluid down through the nerves. So there's a myelinating glial cell. When you put these together they make the myelin sheath, but the name, the myelin sheath, has got quite a dry feel to it, whereas they're living cells full of cranial fluid. So the whole thing, a lot of cranial fluid. Okay, so we're off. So closing your eyes and dropping into the holographic breathing.